Good morning, everyone. Excellent. Call and response. I like it. Welcome back to day 2 of our symposium. It's wonderful to see you, and I'm really excited about the day's lectures that we have ahead of us. So thank you for joining us. I hope the conversations continue in really exciting and dynamic ways. I began my remarks yesterday by saying that this symposium will explore the ways in which a 21st century museum can better serve the collections it stewards and the community it serves. I strongly believe this to be the case. We at the Cincinnati Art Museum are honored to steward the ancient Middle East collection, most notably the Nabatean collection, and to share it with our local, regional, national, and international audiences. Today's talks reflect that commitment as we explore these collections from multiple angles and multiple points of view. Our first 2 speakers this morning will deliver talks that play with and deconstruct notions of Nabatean identity while exploring the adoption and adaptation of iconography across time and culture. Dr. Anderson and Dr. Al-Khoury will both take Nabatean sculptural fragments as a point of departure from which to explore the plurality of identities, voices, and civilizations inherent in these artistic forms. Next, we have what I've dubbed the Greens. First, Dr. Joseph Green will focus on the vast network of the ancient world, which snaked across geographical and cultural landscapes and created moments of intersection. Then, Dr. Jack Green will bring the conversation of the interconnected nature of the ancient world into the present, through his ongoing work exploring community engagement in the preservation and presentation of cultural heritage. When we return from lunch, we'll hear from Dr. Lindsay Allen, whose paper once again traverses geographic space to present the multiple lives of 3 Persepolis fragments that are here on display in Cincinnati. Next, Dr. Elizabeth Macaulay follows the path of a column from Jerash that traveled to New York as a diplomatic gift, detailing some of the implications inherent when a column becomes a cultural ambassador. Our final afternoon session is a little bit of a departure from the rest of the program, but one I'm really excited about. In a series of short talks, several of my museum colleagues will present an aspect of the gallery reinstallation project that isn't always discussed in academic settings. A project of this scale might germinate within a curatorial department, but the refinement and eventual implementation of ideas incorporates the input of nearly every department in the museum. So this series of talks will delve into the intricacies of archival research, introduce the detective work woven into conservation practice, reveal how digital interactives are shaped, demonstrate the creativity inherent in exhibition and graphic design, and offer a behind-the-scenes perspective of how monumental stone objects are mounted within space. Finally, we'll conclude with a panel discussion featuring my museum colleagues alongside Dr. Kersel and Dr. Macaulay that weaves together the physicality of museum practice with the rigorous academic scholarship that creates the foundation of a project this size and scope. But first, there are a few people I would like to quickly introduce as they're helping to facilitate today's events. I'm going to do that awkward thing where I'm going to ask you to stand up and wave, okay, guys? Julia Olsen and Sarah Wenner are our Andrew W. Mellon Curatorial Research Fellows on this project, and they're here in the front row. Excellent. They deserve that and more. Sarah and Julia are both going to help introduce some of our speakers today, and Julia, speakers, is your timekeeper. So look for her, and she's going to be holding up those little signs. We also have Ryan Raplungo, who so kindly assisted to help us in our early research and writing, and he's back today to facilitate with some of this. So Ryan's at the back. He's another graduate student at HUC, so it's great to have him on board. Of course, Trudy Gaba at the back, who is the curatorial assistant in the Department of whatever my department is. And Emily Holtrup, our Director of Learning and Interpretation. So, I would like to now welcome Dr. Andreas Reyes to the stage, who's going to give us a short paper on the ongoing work and legacy of Dr. Judith McKenzie, a name that should be familiar to you all by now, as her profound thinking on Khirbet et Tenor shaped the gallery that you see upstairs. As an introduction, Dr. Reyes is Research Associate in the Subfaculty of Near and Middle Eastern Studies at the Oriental Institute of Oxford University. From 1990 until 1993, he was a junior research fellow in archaeology at St. Hugh's College, Oxford. And from 1993 to 2001, he taught Greek, Latin, and archaeology at the Groton School in Massachusetts. He's written on the archaeology of Cyprus, Egypt, and Jordan, usually as assistant to Judith McKenzie, who, for over 30 years, kindly let him hold the other end of her measuring tape. Sorry, I choke up whenever I read that. You do too, I bet. Please welcome Dr. Reyes.
Thank you. And this is the machine.
Yes,
okay.
yeah.
Good.
There's your clicker.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Yes, that was actually from 1993 to 2021 teaching school, which taught me more than it taught the boys and girls. Right, so Judith, of course, should be the one giving this talk, and I'm sorry she's not able to do so. And having said that, I should also add that this is the first time in over 30 years I've done something like this without Judith having cast a critical eye over it. And so, without wishing to sound defensive, though defensive I will sound, I apologize in advance for any errors. Judith would have made clear where precisely I have it wrong. But she would approve the general tenor and be glad for the new Middle Eastern gallery in the Cincinnati Art Museum, although expressing surprise at finding her and her work prominently a part of it. Now, Dr. Cameron asked me to talk about Judith and her connection to this museum and about continuing aspects of her research. And so I'll begin with Judith's work on Khirbet et Tenor and its architecture, the immediate cause of her association with the Cincinnati Art Museum. After that, we will move to the creation in 2012 of the Manara Al-Afar photo archive of buildings in areas of the Roman Empire that came under Islamic influence. Manara was in part the result of her work studying Khirbet et Tenor, when she realized there was a need for easily accessible photographs for publication of research advancing Middle Eastern studies. The archive, in turn, led her back to her own photographs of Petra, and she wrote an account of her time from 1981 to 1986 among the Bedouin, then living in the caves there, and I'll talk about that second. And then finally, I'll talk about the last manuscript she had advanced considerably before her death in May 2019. And that is a study of what she calls architectural conversion, analyzing the different ways buildings were reused, moving from pagan temple to church or mosque, or possibly to a structure shared by different communities. So we begin with Khirbet Tenor and the Cincinnati Art Museum, which should move on. Oops, there we go. Yeah, one more back. Well, it'll eventually move back. This will be fine. So the original impetus for Judith's study of the material from Khirbet et Tenor in Jordan was the need to examine comparative material for her dissertation. And here you see Sheila Gibson's axonometric. The facade that you are looking at in the gallery is this one here. That's the temple temenos enclosure just beyond it here. Now, as she prepared her thesis, she noted, as had the Abbé Jean Starkey before her, that there were problems with Nelson Glick's reconstruction of the temple. And Judith had actually met the Abbé Jean Starkey, one of her links to a legendary set of archaeologists in Jordan. After Sydney University granted her degree in 1986, preparations for the publication of her book, The Architecture of Petra, based on the dissertation, took up her time, and she put aside the intention to study Khirbet et Tenor. The impetus to return to Khirbet et Tenor came with Queen Noor's visit to the Cincinnati Art Museum in 1994, organized by Glenn Marco, leading to the exhibition called Petra Rediscovered, Lost City of the Nabateans at this museum in 2003. And Judith contributed a chapter to the catalog. Prior to that, Judith and I had made an extended visit to the site in 2001. And out of this visit, she developed her ideas for reconstructing the temenos. And you can see all those stones were the stones that appeared in the previous axonometric. You can just see a set of the temenos wall over here. That's the wall over there. Sadly, that is I walking into the shot at the wrong time. What I'm told is called photobombing. Anyway, so the sculptures of Khirbet et Tanur in the collection of the Cincinnati Art Museum are the largest collection of Nabatean sculpture in any country outside Jordan. Following their discovery in 1937 by Nelson Glick for the American School of Oriental Research in Jerusalem, in collaboration with the Department of Antiquities of Transjordan, the sculpture was divided between the two institutions. Those for Azor were sent to Cincinnati, the sculpture now installed in the new gallery. The remainder are on display in the Amman Citadel Museum. One small problem. From published interim reports, Judith knew that Glick had boxed some material aside from the sculpture and separated these for analysis at a later unspecified date. But Glick died in 1971 before that study could be realized, with only main conclusions published in his book, Deities and Dolphins, in 1965. So, sculptures aside, the missing boxed material had come to Cincinnati, but where were they? Now, Judith elides over this problem in her account of how we discovered the missing boxes. Here's Judith in the Khirbet Tanur report. Judith, Fisher's published elevations have the numbers of the moldings marked on them. This suggested to McKenzie that the drawings of them had been inked for publication even though not published. We eventually discovered them in the American Schools of Oriental Research Nelson Glick archive in the Semitic Museum, Harvard University, along with other records. That's Judith. Now, notice the word eventually, right? There's a lot of work in that sentence. My own recollection is that by chance, one day in 1996, I found myself standing next to Larry Steger, then director of the Semitic Museum, on one of his visits to Groton School in Massachusetts. And Judith and I had just begun to consider the problem of the missing boxes. So I mentioned to Larry Steger that Judith and I were looking for this material, and he simply said something to the effect that, well, the answer was quite easy. The material was in the basement of the Semitic Museum. So an example of how chance serendipity can save research time. Judith again now. At the time of Glick's death in 1971, G. Ernest Wright, president of Azor, had a particular interest in Tel el-Khalifa and was based in the Semitic Museum. He died in 1974, but it was agreed in 1976 that Eleanor Vogel, Glick's assistant, shipped 61 cartons from Cincinnati to the Semitic Museum containing all the material from Tel el-Khalifa, as well as a much smaller quantity from Khirbet et Tanur, the records from the Survey of Jordan, and some of her own materials. That's Judith. So, work began on Khirbet et Tanur from roughly 2001 onward, and this is Judith in the basement of the Semitic Museum. And Judith spent part of each year at Groton School rather than Oxford, and I would drive her to the train station in the morning, and she would head off to the museum. We remain grateful to Joe Green, then deputy director, for arranging access to Glick's archive. Judith also sent Joe to the Cincinnati Art Museum in 2011 to compile a list of material there and to look at some of the sculpture. In the preface to the Khirbet Tanur reports, Judith thanks at the museum James Crump, Matthew Leininger, Jay Patterson, and Jonathan Knowlting. And then in the evenings, I'd pick Judith up from the train station, and she would spend the evenings making pancakes for boys and girls at school. Other research, her book on Alexandria, for example, slowed down the appearance of the Khirbet et Tanur volumes, published finally in 2013. In 2018, Judith began collaborating with the Cincinnati Art Museum on the renovation of the Middle Eastern Gallery. And she was instrumental in procuring grants, providing some advice as well. She was, I know, grateful to Ainsley Cameron and Sarah Wenner for their kindness in including her in their planning. And here I quote from notes on the file on the museum, from the file in the museum at home. here's what Judith says. The Cincinnati Art Museum will enable the Khirbet et Tanur sculpture to be seen again for the 21st century in the best possible context and in a way that will enable community engagement with these important artworks. This material is of great historical importance, and its display in a permanent gallery will provide an enormously valuable vehicle for teaching and learning about the ancient Near East. Now, by way of pendant to this talk, I'll just talk very quickly about Judith's continuing research. The first is the Manara Al-Afar archive. Now, the chronological range of the archive is from Alexander the Great through to the Islamic period. It's work in progress, now run by Ina Jacobs and Miranda Williams at Oxford, with others like Lizzie Macaulay and Joe Green keeping benign watch in the United States. Largely made up of photographs, there are nearly 82,000 in all, carefully curated and labeled. Some 90,000 slides are yet to be processed in the areas of the Mediterranean that you see here. Eventually, plans and maps will be added. The site also maintains Judith's archive of Petra photographs. Version 2.0 of Manara is already up, but officially launches on the 6th of May. The great virtue of the archive is that there are no forms to fill and there are no fees. Simply credit the site and the photographer in your publication. Initially unforeseen by Judith was the usefulness her photographs would come to have as tools for conservation and for heritage study. Taken over 40 years ago, her photographs document continuing loss, either through natural forces, such as erosion, or else through human activity. And here is a tomb, and on the right-hand side of which, you'll see there's the right-hand side, and there it is now collapsed. Manara's turn to heritage studies led to Judith's revision of her diaries for publication. Judith kept these diaries when she and her successive assistants lived in a cave at Petra, measuring facade moldings, in order to develop a relative sequence from which to develop a hypothetical absolute chronology. She therefore devised a novel surveying method using a theodolite to measure moldings in order to record minute stylistic changes over time. And Ernie Wickens of the photogrammetry department of University College London tells me the development of that surveying method alone was worthy of a doctoral degree. Judith arrived in 1981, a crucial moment in the site's history. In 1985, the Bedouil began their move to the new village of Sehun nearby, as directed by the government. Judith therefore wrote this book of her diaries, completing it before she died, as a record of a way of life that was gradually to fade. And so here's Judith in her introduction. Because each of my assistants and I spent so much time socializing with the Bedouil, I came to observe many aspects of Bedouil life in a series of visits. As women, we had access to the world of young girls and women, which men from outside could not access, while we were also sometimes treated as honorary men. And there are the children. There's Angela Phippen, her assistant at the time. Angela's carrying the tripod legs, and the children are carrying the leveling staff and the ranging rods, like the shoemaker and the elves, Judith says, I think, in her book. And then there's her, as an honorary man, she ate with the men, the women would eat afterwards. Thus, the book's value lies not only as an account of Judith's archaeological activity, but also as a record of how the caves traditionally functioned as living spaces, or of how the Bedouil experienced daily life within Petra before the move. Miranda Williams and I edited the memoir, which will appear later this year. Finally, there is the work on architectural conversion, and here's an excerpt from Judith's notes. The original focus of this project was the conversion or transformation of sacred space in the Holy Land and Egypt in late antiquity. This period saw the predominant religion in these regions change from paganism to Christianity and in turn to Islam. Worship at selected sites is followed until they ceased, or some may even continue to the present day. As with the Khirbet et Tanur project, this work involves archival research. Here are plans created by Clarence Fisher, the very same who did the Khirbet et Tanur plans. And below here is a mosque, as Fisher thought, but probably an Islamic prayer room within the church architecture. Miranda Williams, Ross Burns, Floss Wilkins, and I are working on this. What makes Judith's continuing research possible are displays such as the new one at the Cincinnati Art Museum and the museum's commitment to making available material under its care and to support Middle Eastern studies through publications or symposia or other collaborative efforts. Judith would be the first to explain that all the archaeology, all the research is for a wider purpose, the search for greater understanding between peoples and the need for preservation of what is good. What appears unchangeable, like Petra, is apt to disappear if care and attention is not given. At the end of Judith's memoirs, she quotes Harriet Martineau, who in 1847 witnessed the collapse of Facade 66, what Harriet Martineau called the tomb with the Greek inscription. Here's Harriet Martineau. It's natural to suppose a sort of immutability in a rock fastness such as this, but we see here how much depends on the structure of the rock and the influences which operate upon it. As Judith understood, it is up to everyone to ensure that the influences which operate upon the peoples and their movements and their monuments remain well considered and kind and gracious. Thank you.